"Get out of the car," the officer screamed, his gun drawn. I was being arrested for a felony hit and run. Across town, my sister and parents were celebrating, certain I would go to prison for the crash she caused. I didn't argue. I just let the handcuffs click around my wrists as the officer's weapon remained fixed on me, his eyes cold and unwavering. They forgot one tiny detail. As the cold steel bit into my skin, I did not shake. I did not beg. I just looked down at the biometric watch pulsing on my left wrist. My family thinks they have buried me under a pile of physical lies, but they do not understand that data is the only truth that does not bleed. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories channel. I'm currently enjoying a warm cup of coffee and watching the view outside. There's a profound peace in these quiet moments, which feels so distant from the cold, calculated betrayal I faced that night. Before we reveal the truth, where are you listening from, and what's your favorite drink right now? Grab your mug, and let's return to that patrol car. The molded hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser was specifically engineered for maximum physical discomfort. With my hands tightly cuffed behind my back, every pothole and sharp Austin turn on the 20-minute ride to the precinct sent a rigid, bruising shockwave up my spine. I did not shift. I did not complain about the steel biting into my wrists. I stared out the wire mesh window, watching the blurred neon signs of the city bleed through the raindrops, streaking across the glass. In a bizarre, almost terrifying way, my mind felt like a perfectly calibrated machine. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 32 years. My parents, Christopher and Amanda, viewed me as a utility, a reliable data point they could move around whenever their lives got messy. The dinner at the Westlake Hills mansion 3 days ago was a masterpiece of emotional theater. My mother claimed she missed me. She said Samantha had finally matured, that the recklessness was a thing of the past. I should have known better. During that meal, Samantha hugged me tightly, crying theatrical tears onto my shoulder. She was not apologizing for the decades of calculated cruelty. She was pickpocketing my biometric security key from the interior pocket of my coat. That key was the physical piece of evidence they needed to place me at the intersection of 4th and Elm at 9:14 p.m. tonight. They thought a physical token would be enough to end my life and save Samantha's $1,500,000 image. I sat there in the dark of the patrol car and realized my entire childhood had been an invisible chain. For 32 years, I had lived in a prison without bars, a psychological cage where the songbirds never sang. People call it being the quiet one. In reality, it was a survival mechanism called learned helplessness, or what I like to call my silent chain. I stayed quiet because, in a house ruled by Christopher and Amanda's narcissism, silence was the only armor I had. But while they were busy pampering Samantha, I was busy becoming an architect. They thought I was just enduring their neglect, but I was actually building a digital fortress. Every dismissive comment was a line of code. Every time they liquidated my needs to fund Samantha's influencer lifestyle, it was another layer of encryption for my soul. They treated my compassion as a luxury they could overdraft without limit. Now, they finally hit the ceiling. They think they have traded my freedom for Samantha's brand deals and a $1 million wedding. They assumed I would stay in that silent chain, weeping in a holding cell, accepting whatever plea deal a public defender shoved in front of me. They forgot that I do not just study data, I live in it. I knew exactly when that SUV hit the minivan because my heart rate never spiked. My family thinks they have framed a victim. They do not realize they have just invited an auditor to their own destruction. This is not a breakdown. This is a balance sheet, and it is time to settle the debt. The cruiser lurched to a halt inside the subterranean parking garage of the Austin Central Precinct. The heavy door was yanked open, and the arresting officer hauled me out by the bicep. The transition from the freezing night air to the suffocating, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of the precinct was jarring. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor bleakage, and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. I was marched through the chaotic bullpen. Phones were ringing, keyboards were clattering, and uniformed officers were shouting over the din. None of them looked at me with curiosity. To them, I was not a human being with a history. I was a file number. I was the monster who had T-boned a family minivan and fled into the dark. They walked me straight into the Violent Crimes Division and shoved me into Interrogation Room B. The room was a textbook example of psychological deprivation. It was a claustrophobic concrete box painted in a nauseating shade of off-white. A single bright fluorescent tube buzzed angrily overhead. In the center was a bolted-down steel table with two heavily scuffed aluminum chairs. One entire wall was dominated by a massive, perfectly clean, two-way mirror. The officer unhooked my handcuffs, only to immediately recuff my right wrist to a heavy iron ring welded directly to the center of the steel table. "Sit tight," he muttered, not making eye contact. The heavy metal door slammed shut, and the deadbolt engaged with a final, echoing clack. I sat perfectly still. I did not panic, and I did not stare at the mirror. I sat there and mentally audited the last 4 years of my life. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I was calculating the return on investment on my compliance, and the result was 0. 45 minutes later, the deadbolt snapped open. A man in a cheap, rumpled gray suit walked in, carrying a thick manila folder and a styrofoam cup of black coffee. This was Detective Bradley. He had the exhausted, cynical posture of a man who had spent 20 years listening to guilty people lie to his face. He did not introduce himself. He pulled up the chair opposite me and sat down, the metal legs screeching harshly against the floor. He tossed the folder onto the table. "You want to tell me why you're sitting in my precinct tonight, Madison?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on me like a predator assessing wounded prey. "I imagine you're going to tell me, Detective," I replied. My voice was completely level, stripped of any emotion or tremor. Bradley's jaw tightened. He did not like the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. It broke the script he was used to. "You had a few too many drinks, you panicked, and you left a family bleeding out on 4th and Elm," he said, leaning forward into my physical space. "We found your biometric security chip on the floorboard of the SUV. We have an anonymous eyewitness who saw a woman in a dark hoodie, roughly your build, sprinting from the scene into the rain. In that light, at that distance, you're the perfect fit. If you confess now, the district attorney might go easy. If you lie, I will personally ensure you serve the full 10 years." I looked at the plastic evidence bag containing my stolen key. Then I locked eyes with him. "That is a beautifully constructed narrative, Detective. It's neat. But structurally, it is a catastrophic failure. You don't have a hit and run. You have a $1,500,000 insurance policy sitting in front of you." Bradley paused, the cup frozen halfway to his mouth. I did not wait for him to ask. "Check the digital ledger for my grandfather's trust fund. You will find that Christopher and Amanda Henderson withdrew $1,500,000 last month. They exploited an old power of attorney I'd forgotten to revoke and used forged digital signatures to bypass the bank's security protocols. They needed to cover Samantha's gambling debts and a failing brand contract before her high society wedding." Bradley scoffed, shaking his head with a tired grin. He told me to save the conspiracy theories for my public defender. I did not flinch. I told him I did not need a public defender. I needed the clear plastic bin sitting in the evidence locker. Inside that bin was my enterprise-grade smartphone, the digital shield I had spent years perfecting. I told him that if he handed it to me, I would give him the exact GPS coordinates and biometric heart rate data of the felons who actually orchestrated the crash. I watched his cynical superiority falter. He was a pragmatist, and he had a mother in the ICU and a district attorney who wanted a watertight conviction by sunrise. The silence in that claustrophobic concrete box stretched for 20 seconds before Bradley finally pushed his chair back. The metal legs shrieked against the floor as he walked to the heavy iron door. 2 minutes later, he returned with the bin. He unlocked my right wrist from the table ring and warned me that he was watching my every move. I did not acknowledge the threat. I did not massage my bruised skin. I reached for the matte black device and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen flared to life, casting a sharp bluish glow across the nauseating off-white walls. I tapped into an encrypted health monitoring application. I explained to Bradley that the human body reacts to a high-speed collision with an unavoidable surge of cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rates spike to over 140 beats per minute. I turned the phone around, sliding it across the steel table so the minute-by-minute line graph was directly under his nose. At exactly 9:14 p.m., the precise moment of impact, my heart rate was a steady, resting 60 beats per minute. My respiratory rate was 12 breaths per minute. I was not T-boning a minivan. I was in a state of deep, restorative sleep. I pointed to the secondary data point. My device's internal GPS was statically pinging my apartment's private Wi-Fi router, exactly 12 miles away from the intersection of 4th and Elm. Bradley stared at the graph, his eyes narrowing. He was a veteran cop. He knew that smartwatch telemetry was increasingly being used to establish irrefutable alibis. It was not just data. It was biological perjury prevention. I told him that unless he believed I managed to cause a catastrophic wreck while remaining in a medically induced coma, he was currently holding the wrong suspect. My tone was merciless, a surgical strike against the narrative my family had built. He swallowed hard, looking up from the screen. He admitted the data proved I was not driving, but it did not explain how my physical biometric chip ended up on the floorboard of the suspect vehicle. I pulled the phone back toward me, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard with surgical precision. I told him that the chip did not lie. It was just a physical shadow cast by a much larger digital architecture. And I was the architect who was about to dismantle the person who planted it. I bypassed the security firewall and opened a secured two-factor authenticated enterprise gateway. You see, my private logistics firm holds the exclusive multi-million-dollar contract to manage the telematics for the corporate fleet that owns that exact SUV. Detective Bradley's posture stiffened as he realized I was not just defending myself, I was auditing a crime scene from 3 states away. Modern luxury vehicles are not just cars, they are rolling data servers. I filtered the raw back-end logs by the specific vehicle identification number, and a wall of code flooded the screen. At exactly 9:13 and 42 seconds, the vehicle's onboard computer registered a catastrophic, hard-braking event. 2 seconds later, the frontal airbag deployment sensor triggered, but the collision telemetry was just noise. I was looking for the primary cabin sensors. I tapped a specific line of code and turned the phone back to him. To prevent airbags from killing children, these seats are equipped with highly calibrated weight sensors. At the moment of impact, the driver's seat registered exactly 115 pounds of kinetic mass. I am 5'9" and I weigh 142 pounds. My younger sister, Samantha, is 5'2" and weighs exactly 115 pounds. Bradley completely stopped moving, the paper cup in his hand, crinkling under his grip. His career-making felony case was disintegrating, replaced by a much darker conspiracy. Samantha stole my ID at that dinner, drove drunk, crushed that family, and planted my key to save her upcoming wedding. But planting the ID was not the end of the trap. They needed to force the police to arrest me before I could establish an alibi. I took the phone back one last time to incinerate the rest of their narrative. I minimized the logistics server and opened a 2-factor administrative portal for a major national cellular provider. For the last 5 years, Christopher and Amanda have refused to pay their own cellular bills. To avoid the constant arguments, I migrated their numbers onto my corporate enterprise plan. As the legal owner of this corporate enterprise account, I have the absolute right to audit all metadata and logs associated with these lines. I'm not hacking. I'm simply exercising my administrative oversight. I am the primary account holder and the legal owner of the devices they carry. I selected the line registered to my mother, Amanda, and filtered the daily call log. Precisely 10 minutes after the airbags deployed, her phone initiated an outgoing call to 911 emergency services. But I didn't just see the call log, detective. As the primary administrator and designated emergency contact on their devices, I received an automated crash detection alert the millisecond those airbags deployed. My system didn't just ping their location, it captured the 30-second ambient audio buffer that modern smartphones automatically upload to emergency contacts during a severe impact. I heard the panic, the coordination, and the cold calculation in my mother's voice before she ever dialed 911. It was not an anonymous concerned citizen, it was my mother. I tapped the screen once more, opening the network geolocation tab. A high-resolution map materialized with overlapping blue circles. The collision occurred at 4th and Elm, in the heart of the downtown grid, but Amanda's device did not ping a downtown tower. It pinged a localized tower in the middle of West Lake Hills, an exclusive gated suburb 12 miles away from the crash site. My mother did not see me running from the wreckage, detective. She was sitting in her own living room, drinking Cabernet while she filed a false police report to frame her oldest daughter. Bradley finally exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate the cynical superiority he'd carried into the room. He was not looking at a suspect anymore. He was looking at the architect of the most airtight conspiracy case his department would see this decade. He reached for his radio to dispatch units to Westlake Hills, but I held up a hand. I did not raise my voice, but the surgical authority in my tone froze his hand halfway to the microphone. "You don't just want an arrest, detective," I said, leaning back as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "If you kick their door down now, Christopher will hire a $500 an hour defense attorney. They will claim the phone was hacked or the SUV was stolen. What you really want, what the district attorney needs, is a full, uncoerced confession caught on tape." I picked up my smartphone one last time. When Christopher and Amanda bought that sprawling estate, they did not know how to set up the encrypted smart home network. I installed the high-definition cameras and the automation for them. They were far too arrogant and far too technologically illiterate to ever ask me to transfer the master administrative privileges. I bypassed the telecom portal and opened a sleek black application. They think I am sitting in a cold holding cell right now, which means they are currently sitting in their living room, completely unguarded. But the digital detail they truly overlooked was not just the cameras. It was the smart vacuum robot they had insisted on keeping in the main living room. I tapped the interface for the cleaning unit. Most people see a vacuum. I see a mobile, internet-connected microphone with 360-degree audio-visual recording capabilities. I hit the command to retrieve the buffered cache from 9:30 p.m. The audio flared to life through the interrogation room speakers. The crackle of the gas fireplace provided the background noise to Samantha's hysterical, high-pitched whine. "Stop crying, Samantha. Just stop." Christopher's voice snapped, sounding as arrogant as if he were in a boardroom. "The police have the ID. They have Amanda's phone call. It's a closed loop." "But Mom, I hit them." Samantha sobbed, the sound of her expensive silk dress rustling as she paced. The metal it crushed. "I saw them through the glass. You have to make sure they find the chip. You have to throw Madison's backup key away so they never look at me." "We already did, honey." Amanda's voice was chillingly calm, the sound of a crystal glass clinking against a coaster echoing through the speaker. "Madison is strong. She can survive a few years in a facility. Her career is already built. You need this wedding, Samantha. We did what we had to do to protect the family." Bradley sat in absolute silence, his eyes locked onto my screen as he watched his entire investigation transform into a federal conspiracy case. He slowly reached for the heavy black radio clip on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Detective Bradley," he growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "Priority 1, I need multiple patrol units to Westlake Hills for an emergency arrest. We have a confirmed confession and an active flight risk. Secure the perimeter before they can destroy the evidence. Approach with silent sirens. Do not let them hear you coming." Bradley stood up and connected my smartphone to the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the interrogation room wall. The contrast was jarring. One moment, the screen was a dark void. Then it flared into the warm, amber-lit luxury of the Westlake Hills living room. It was like watching a high-definition movie of a life I had already resigned from. Christopher was pacing the length of a $5,000 Persian rug, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. Amanda was sitting on the custom leather sofa, her face finally relaxing into a mask of smug satisfaction. And Samantha, the golden child, was already scrolling through her tablet, likely looking at honeymoon destinations paid for by the fund she had just helped steal. We sat in absolute silence for exactly 14 minutes. We watched them toast to their successful disposal of the family problem. They looked so powerful in that frame, surrounded by high-end art and crown molding. But as I watched them, I realized they were suffering from the illusion of power from an empty wallet. This is a psychological trap, where people believe their social standing and expensive surroundings grant them a form of immunity. They thought that because they lived behind a gated community, the rules of reality did not apply to them. They did not realize that their power was a lease they could no longer afford to renew. Their wallet was not just empty of money, it was empty of any actual leverage. They had spent decades trading my labor for their status, and now that the source was cut off, they were nothing but ghosts in a very expensive house. The ambient lighting on the video feed suddenly shifted. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of their living room, violent strobing flashes of red and blue began to paint the walls. The police cruisers had cut their sirens, but the light bars were blinding. Christopher froze. His scotch glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Amanda stood up so fast, she knocked over a side table, a bottle of $300 wine shattering on the floor. "Christopher, what is that?" she whispered, her voice picked up flawlessly by the thermostat microphone. They did not have time to craft a lie. They did not have time to call a lawyer or delete a single text message. The heavy custom mahogany front door did not just open, it exploded inward with a deafening, splintering crash. "Police! Search warrant! Show me your hands!" 6 heavily armed officers flooded into the room. Samantha let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream as an officer grabbed her by the arm and slammed her face first into the leather sofa, ratcheting heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. Her $3,000 silk dress was wrinkled against the floor, a perfect metaphor for her ruined brand. Christopher dropped to his knees, his hands trembling violently above his head. The man who had spent 30 years controlling every narrative was now just a man in a rumpled shirt, begging for a phone call that would never come. Amanda was sobbing uncontrollably as an officer read her the exact same Miranda rights I had listened to on the highway less than 2 hours ago. They were caught in the very net they had woven for me. Bradley exhaled a long, heavy breath and turned off the monitor. He reached across the table, took a small silver key from his pocket, and unlocked the iron cuff binding my right wrist. The metal fell away with a final, satisfying clatter. "You're free to go, Madison," he said softly. "I'll have an officer drive you back to your vehicle, and I will personally ensure your booking is voided and the charges are dropped before the sun even comes up." I picked up my smartphone, watching the last frame of Samantha being dragged out of the house. I did not feel joy. I felt the clinical satisfaction of a job completed. I walked out of that interrogation room, leaving the door wide open behind me. Walking out of the Austin precinct, I did not feel like a victim who had narrowly escaped. I felt like a system that had successfully purged a virus. The sunrise was painting the skyline in shades of burnt orange and gold, the kind of light that does not hide anything. By the time the first commuters were hitting the road, my arrest record had been scrubbed and a new set of files had been opened for Christopher, Amanda, and Samantha. The legal fallout was swift and absolute. Because the police had a high-definition, live-streamed confession, my family's expensive attorneys were functionally useless. Samantha was sentenced to a mandatory 8 years in a state penitentiary for a felony hit-and-run resulting in severe bodily injury. The Brooks family did not wait for the sentencing. They canceled the wedding and publicly distanced themselves from the scandal before the sun even went down that day. Christopher and Amanda did not escape the blast radius. They were convicted of federal obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit perjury. To pay for their catastrophic legal fees, they were forced to liquidate the Westlake Hills estate and their entire investment portfolio. They avoided prison, but they were permanently bankrupted, forced into a small rental in a different state. When they tried to call me from a prepaid burner phone months later to beg for family mercy, I did not answer. I simply located the phone's coordinates and blacklisted the device from every cellular network I manage. This was not cruelty. It was a final firewall. I recovered the $1,500,000 they stole from me, but I did not use it to buy a mansion or a fleet of cars. I used it to establish the Madison Henderson Foundation for Digital Justice, a fund dedicated to helping victims of family exploitation who do not have the technical skills to defend themselves. I have come to realize that blood is just biology, but family is architecture. It is built on trust, respect, and the courage to show up for each other when the lights are flashing. For 32 years, I thought my value was determined by how useful I could be to people who only loved me when they needed a scapegoat. I was wrong. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you are the one always left on the fringe, remember that you are the architect of your own story. You have the right to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to cut the chains that try to keep you small. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free and finally start building a life on your own terms. If you believe that the truth is